Hi, Sashi. It's wonderful to be with you this
Wonderful
evening.
to be with you, Shashi. Long
In
time we've
fact,
known each other.
yes, a very long time, and we haven't met as often as we should, but this is a good occasion.
It is
Uh,
indeed.
in
Thank you for
fact,
doing it.
when Nirmala Lakshman called me and told me or asked me whether I'd be in conversation with Shashi Tharoor, the Hindu Lit Fest, I said nothing would please me more than that. And so I'm very happy. And then I wrote to you and suggested that we should probably have a freewheeling discussion on what was in the top of my mind: life, literature, language, and politics, all of which you're involved with. And you said that's a good idea. So that's what we are going to do. Uh, in between that, I must admit that I had overlooked a PDF copy of his latest book, which is the context of this discussion in the Hindu Lit Fest: Pride, Prejudice, and Punditry.
This
But
is
I
actually the
managed,
first event, Shashi, on this book.
first book, yes, first event. But I did catch up with it, and so I spent all of yesterday and a bit of the day before racing through the book. In any case, it's a 500 plus 525 page plus volume, and I couldn't have done a close study of it even within a week or two. But I must say it was wonderful reading it, and Sashi is at his best there, of course, as a raconteur. He introspects, he reflects on issues. There is his passion for language. There is his acerbic wit, all of that shining through. And it's, I think, first of all, from Aleph, this book, Pride, Prejudice, and Punditry, even if it's a plug on my behalf for my namesake, I think all of you should read it. It's well worth the time you spend with it. So,
Thank
Sashi,
you.
let's start in the sequence that I thought we'd speak about: life. Now, when I read this book, it's an eclectic collection of sorts. What struck me is when you look at your oeuvre. I mean, you're no longer. I mean, you're not by any stretch of imagination at a position where you need to look back on life. You're in the thick of it, and there's a long way to go. But nevertheless, you have a substantial body of work, and one could speak in terms of the Tharoor oeuvre, if you like. How would you characterize it? Would it be, as Isaiah Berlin calls it, the fox approach or the hedgehog approach?
The fox knows a little bit about lots of things, and
Yes,
the hedgehog knows lots about one thing. No,
yes,
I would say I'm probably a fox in that regard. When you mention this business about looking back on my life and career, the truth is that I already had a bit of a shock a couple of years ago when the crossword people gave me a lifetime achievement award. And I thought, my gosh, that's the kind of thing you give people in their absolute dotage, when
yeah,
you're no longer expecting anything more particularly interesting or original from them. And suddenly there I was with a lifetime achievement award. I mean, it was an opportunity to accept that I have inflicted enough on the reading public that I can look at a lifetime of work. And when David Davidar wanted to do this for Aleph, it was a couple of things in mind. It was the 10th anniversary of his publishing house,
yeah.
even though I've known him as a publisher for over 30 years, but in the new house, it's 10. And secondly, because, of course, it marks 40 years of published books. My first book came out in 1981, Reasons of State. And it also is, in many ways, a half a century of writing in print, more than half a century, really, if you go back to my earlier scribbles in the Junior Statesman and so on. And that means that in some ways, it is fitting to have a volume that will expose a new readership to some of the variety of thoughts and concerns I've had. And I welcomed it for that reason. I have, as you know, I have an interest in history, but very much an amateur interest. I did an honors degree in history and really never studied history again. So I would never dare or presume to call myself a historian. But I have an amateur's interest in history, and I've written about particularly the history of modern India with a lot of passion, and I dare say some knowledge. As a politician, as well as in my pre-political life, I've written about politics. And there are some differences really between my insights from the outside, when I could see the wood and not the trees, and my perception from the inside, where perhaps I'm overwhelmed sometimes by the trees. And you can see a taste of both in the Indian politics section of this book, because, for example, the macro view, with my arguing a case for a presidential system,
Yeah.
I first did that a dozen years before I even came into politics.
Yeah.
But an essay like The Life of an MP is about my actual daily experience as an MP with what people, my constituents, come and ask me. So you've got all of that.
Right.
Then there's a bit of world affairs, my memories of Kofi Annan and some of my global thoughts. Hinduism, I thought, was a worthy inclusion, even though really it only features in two of my books, which are strongly overlapping books, because the fact is that today there is an understanding of Hinduism that is not mine, and I felt it necessary to lay out my markers there. And I thought it was worth offering some excerpts from that writing in order to share with readers my perspective. Aleph also went in for my passion, which is cricket, and that's something which I've been watching Test cricket since I was 7 years old, and I've written about it, not very much of late, but occasional pieces which are also in this collection. Then some slightly whimsical, light-hearted pieces from some of my magazine columns, some writing about writing, and then of course there is fiction. And the fiction is something which every time I publish a book, without fail, some fans will write saying, why have you not published a novel again? And it's now been 20 years. So I owe them an answer. And I think in some ways, publishing this selection of excerpts from my fictional work is as much a reminder to me that I began life as a fiction writer and need to find again my vocation in that area. Rather than become the political polemicist that in some people's minds I've been reduced to. And then finally, they've tossed in some speeches as well, which obviously are not as polished as the written pieces, because they're not meant to be. I mean, they were actually transcriptions of what I spoke.
The spoken word, as you call it.
That's right. So that's the whole thing, Shashi. And as far as looking back on this book is concerned, I'm happy to have it, particularly for those who are interested in all my work but will never read 22 books. Here they get a flavor of pretty much most of the 22 and the concerns in that 22, which, as you asked, are the concerns of a fox.
Right. That's wonderful. I found, there was the personal Tharoor emerging from this, which is very valuable. We get to know a lot more about you from your college days, about your parents. There's also, of course, you don't touch anywhere too much about the loss that you've had about your wife. Of course, you are, I think, legitimately upset about the way you've been, it's been bandied about, particularly in the media and in public, and the short shrift that you got at the hands of, even a bulk of the media, shall we say. But looking at it as a Stephanian, for instance, one of the things that struck me is, you have this anecdote about Natwar Singh, who speaks to all of you in college and warns you not to join the civil service because you then have to take be the behest of some politician, and you, I think, say that that's probably why you steered clear of getting into the civil services, but went on to the UN, and then you had a good shot at becoming Secretary General, which you lost for being your own man, as it were. They wanted someone, that's the implication I get, who is not independent-minded. Now that you're in politics, do you think being independent-minded is a liability? And in the party that you're in, at the stage that you're in, where you're identified with the G23, whatever that means, what is the lesson that you've learned? Or will you continue to be your own, spokesperson? Will you continue to be what you want to do?
Shashi, I mean, the truth is that, first of all, on the G23, there really is no such animal. A group of senior colleagues wrote a letter, invited some of us who were able to be in Delhi during the COVID pandemic to come in and sign it. There were some colleagues who were able to travel from other places. There were some colleagues who were already living in Delhi and who were able to sign it. And that was as simple as that. There was no formal organization. I dare say there are many who share the sentiments expressed in the letter who couldn't come and sign it. And there are some who've signed the letter who moved away from its contents since then. So there is no formal G23. I should make that very clear. But having said that, as you probably noticed over the years, I have never ceased to be my own man. I have my own mind. I believe it is my duty to express my thoughts. I said very clearly to people from the start that I didn't acquire my political convictions through being in politics. I had my convictions, my values, my principles, and I expressed them in my writing for almost 2 decades before I actually came into politics. What am I saying? But for a quarter of a century, I expressed them from my first book in 81 to my entry in politics in 2008, which was 27 years. And therefore, I already had a fully formed political philosophy, which in the first dozen years or so of my writing actually was not congruent with the Congress parties. And I was a critic of the Congress party, a fact of which many people reminded the Congress president at the time, Mrs. Gandhi, when she was considering my nomination to a seat in parliament. But anyway, when I came into the party, my principal opponents in Thiruvananthapuram were at that point were the left. Now they're the BJP. But the left would park a lawyer fellow in the audience in each of my public gatherings to get up and read aloud excerpts from my earlier writings that were critical of the Congress party. And challenged me to disown them. And I said, I don't disown them. But don't forget, I'm not fighting the elections of 1977. I'm fighting the elections of 2009. And that usually was enough for the audience to accept my bona fides as a former critic, now turned supporter in the current climate of the Congress party. And yes, I have sometimes rightly and justifiably been accused of having spoken out of turn. The party felt impelled to withdraw my official status as spokesman because I said things that were not the party line. And every once in a while, I continue to say things which the party finds convenient to disavow. Most recently was before the 2019 elections, when I said if the BJP is re-elected, the country could become a Hindu Pakistan, and the Congress party official spokesman denounced the expression, having unfortunately overlooked the fact that the phrase comes from Jawaharlal Nehru and not from me. But I was using it, and therefore I was promptly disowned. So I've understood that my idiosyncratic willingness to speak my mind is not always the most welcome thing in politics. And I've realized that there may be a price to be paid for being my own man. But I have always felt that if I'm not my own man, then I'm not bringing anything useful to politics. If I'm just a cookie cutter politician, as the Americans would say, somebody who blindly parrots whatever the party wants him to parrot and does what the party wants him to do, the party could get 100 other people to do that for them. Whereas if they want me, then they get me with my idiosyncrasies and all. And so far, anyway, they have been willing to renominate me for the ticket from Thiruvananthapuram, even though they know that I've not always fallen in line with them. And I take it in that spirit, Shashi. I will be myself. I'm loyal. Sometimes when I disagree with the party, I do consider it wiser just to be silent on some issues.
Sure.
But there are occasions when I'm obliged to disagree with the party, and I do so. And I think so far, at least some elements in the party have always accepted that there was a principled, logical reason why I took the stand I did.
One of the things that comes across very strongly is your hatred for those who switch sides politically. I think you're quite strong about that. You say, in fact, you use a term which is about striptease. I forget the term that you use, the word, that you can't be shedding your party like you shed clothes, in a striptease or something like that. And this is interesting because paradoxically, partly a media creation or largely a media creation, no doubt, you were also seen as a soft, shall we say, subject when it comes to being poached by the BJP or someone who could be a candidate for the BJP. You've actually gone to great extent to explicitly deny that and say that, how this is, there's nothing, you've never even thought of this, thoughts not even occurred to you. But why does this happen? Is it because you're ambivalent about things? Is it because you're equivocal? For example, your approach to Modi in the book, there are sections where you seem to be in awe of the man, where you seem to admire some of his qualities. And there are sections where you're very acerbic, you're very critical. His foreign Johns, that his foreign policy is a total disaster, his Hindutva, and all of that, and that he's destroyed the secular foundations of India. So is this a problem that you're being a writer and you see both sides of an issue? Is that necessarily a virtue in politics or a liability?
No, I'm prepared to accept that many would see it as a liability, Shashi. I just feel an obligation to be myself. And the myself that I am will sometimes indeed see merit in what my opponents and critics say. I've been that way all my life. I mean, I've never been dogmatic, even as a UN official. I have a point of view. If somebody is able to convince me that their point of view is equally valid or even wiser, I'm prepared to change my mind. And that's something that is not respected in politics, where you have to stick rigidly to a party line, whether you agree it or not. But I do want to say those who thought I would switch to the BJP simply haven't read me. They are not literate people, because nobody who has read me would believe that I would switch there. I have said that people have every right. See, a political party is two things. It is a vehicle for ideas, and it is an organization that constitutes that vehicle.
Yes.
So the ideas, values, and principles I have are in the Congress party today, and do simply not fit into the BJP. The Congress party as an organizational vehicle is a different matter. If people like Jyotiraditya Scindia or Jitin Prasad felt that the organization of the Congress party was not satisfying their political aspirations, and they had either left to start their own party or joined a like-minded party, another one with the same sets of principles and values, I don't think that I would have the right to be critical, because each individual has to judge at what point the vehicle is going in the destination that he agrees we need to go. But if you leave the vehicle altogether and go into a vehicle that is going in the opposite direction, then what are your principles worth? So the article, the essay in the book, which on that particular subject, Shashi, is not a criticism of abandoning parties, because you rightly implied through your own question that I'm not a rigid party man. I have my own convictions. But what it is a criticism of the abandonment of principle. A politics without principle, to me, is not politics at all. So I feel that my convictions are not for sale. And I would have hoped that someone like these two individuals are both friends of mine. And I would say Scindia was one of the best and most articulate voices of the Congress in both English and Hindi against the BJP. And to see him seemingly expressing with the same sincerity, earnestness, and enthusiasm the opposite point of view on BJP policies versus Congress, to me, is just incomprehensible. It's not a question of, as you say, being acerbic or hostile about it makes me question whether anything he said in his previous avatar was real. Imagine if, like his father, he had got angry with the Congress organization and set up, let's say, a Madhya Pradesh regional party or even a Gwalior regional party, whatever, with the same political principles that he has defended, but with a different organizational vehicle which would serve his political ambitions better. Mm-hmm. I don't think that you and I can sit here in judgment on him, because he has remained true to his principles, but he has pursued his ambitions. But when you pursue your ambitions at the cost of your principles, then you raise fundamental questions about whether you have any principles and what those principles are worth. And this is my problem. I mean, in the sense that I will occasionally go out of line as far as the Congress party is concerned, but never have I betrayed the values and principles that I've stood by for as long as I've been in public life, and arguably since well before I was in public life and was writing books and articles in the media.
In fact, you take that nuanced position, and you're proud of the Congress in Kerala, for instance, when you say that Karunakaran or PC Chako, they might have set up their own faction in the party, or PC Chako went to the NCP, which is an extension, in your view, of the Congress values. But subsequently, what's happening now must be very embarrassing for you, where many of your leaders in the Kerala Congress have crossed over to the CPM, which by your definition must be exactly the opposite of what they stood for.
No, in fact, it makes me utterly cynical about the CPM as well, that a party supposedly built on a very rigid ideological apparatus with literally a century and a half of literature, writings, exegeses, and theories, with a Politburo and usually a member for ideology of the Politburo sitting there, that such a party could accept these congressmen suggests to me that even the CPM should really rename itself Kerala Desam or something like Telugu Desam, because that's all they are. They are a regional party with ambitions in one state and absolutely no political ideology worth the name.
Right. But is there a Congress in Kerala at all now, as we speak?
No, there is certainly. I've just come from a number of Congress party functions, which I have tweeted about, so I'm not revealing any secrets. One was a meeting of our representatives at the panchayat level in my parliamentary constituency, talking to them about how to reach out to the grassroots of people in order to try and help them, be a benefit to them. And the other function was in one ward of the 100 wards in my constituency, in my city, where that ward committee held a ceremony to give awards to all the student high achievers when the recent examination results came out in Kerala. And I was the one asked to inaugurate that function, give away the awards. And this sort of thing shows me political parties at their best. I'm not a great fan of demonstration politics and dharnas and strikes. And too many people in the media seem to judge the effectiveness of a party only by how many times it's in the streets courting arrest. I know that has to be done once in a while to show the passion with which you believe something. But a lot of the daily life of politicians and political parties ought to be in connection with society, the society in which they live and work. I feel satisfied when a Congress party worker comes to me with a little old lady who's entitled to a BPL, below the poverty line card, has not been denied it because she's not a communist voter. That happens all the time in Kerala. The communists claim to stand for the proletariat, but they will stiff the proletariat if the proletariat is not inclined to vote for them. And when people come to me with people like this, I'm happy to help. Or when a student suddenly loses a parent and is not able to pay her final year fees and so on, I try and help them out of my own pocket, because to my mind, these are the kinds of things that actually translate into politics as social service, which to my mind is what politics really ought to be about. If you have larger political aspirations and policy interests, as I do, you can pursue them at the national level. But if you want the electoral legitimacy to be able to debate laws and make policies, then you have to be relevant to ordinary people in the society or the subsection of society that you represent. And there, I think the Congress still hasn't lost the plot. They're still there and they're doing that kind of thing. And that's what I believe needs to be done.
Another aspect of your thinking, which emerges from your writings, is that while you're all praised for Pandit Nehru, the first decades of independence, you don't seem to be in full concurrence on the idea of socialist economics or idea of subsidies. You seem to be viscerally against these ideas. You, for instance, praise Nehru as a Democrat, as a very tolerant person, as someone who sees the oppositional point of view. No mention about the fact, coming from Kerala as you are, that he dismissed the EMS government in 1959, which could hardly be called a democratic act. So, do you you're blindsided on some of these aspects of the Congress, and I think from what you just said as well, there's hardly any mention about the communists or the left in your book, except of course to bash them as you've just done. Is that a fair thing to do? Because after all, the left comes to power in Kerala alternately, and this time, consecutively, they must be doing something right?
Sure. So Shashi, let me answer. You raised several points on socialism. Indian socialism sadly degenerated very quickly into bureaucratic capitalism. That is that you had bureaucrats instead of businessmen on the commanding heights of the economy, making decisions they were not either trained or qualified to make and had no incentive to succeed in making. And so this condemning the nation to large numbers of loss-making public sector enterprises, draining the taxpayers' money, was to me just bad economics and common sense. I'm not an economic ideologue, but I think I do have enough common sense. I'm somebody who manages his own budget with some principles of respect for avoiding unnecessary debt and so on, and trying to do things sensibly and fairly frugally. And I respect that, but I don't respect the kind of profligacy that came on the backs of bad economics. And I would say that by the late 1980s, if not earlier, it was crystal clear that our economic policies had created a massive, inefficient, bureaucratized state apparatus without any corresponding benefits for the Indian people. And that one of the best things the Congress Party ever did, in my view, was 1991, the liberalization, which made possible channels such as the one you started. Wouldn't have been possible in the previous era. There was an opening up of economic space as well as related activities in the fields of information, media, education, health, and so on, which have been transformative in India. I mean, I don't think that reducing liberalization to the sudden availability of foreign brand names in India, which is what everyone does, is fair, because that's only one part of it, and I would say the most superficial part of it. So as an NRI, I had to notice it, because till then, every time I came, I had to bring rather ordinary items of daily consumption from the West, which were not available in India. And suddenly that became no longer necessary because everything was available in India. So as an NRI of the day, I saw that that made a difference to people's daily lives. But the much larger issue was the opening up of horizons, the opening up of possibilities. And those actually made a lot of our economic growth and prosperity possible.
Having said that,
communists, just to finish on the second part of your question. The communists, I agree with them on two principles solidly. One is secularism, or the importance of upholding a bigotry-free society. We tend to have similar instincts on social issues. I believe, and I believe at least India's communists believe, it wasn't true of other communist parties necessarily, that the government has no place in the kitchen, no place at the dining table, no place in the bedroom, and the communists tend to have the same approach, and that's very good. Similarly, I share the faith in the promotion of equality and social justice that the communists claim to be about. What troubles me about the communists is their hopeless ideology, and even worse, their interpretation of the ideology, which led them, for example, to oppose the introduction of computers into India, and the CPM sent gundas to the offices that first introduced computers, LIC offices and so on, to smash them and break them. That kind of troglodyte mentality was a confirmation of the fact that this is a party that is unable to deal with modernity. Similarly, they oppose mobile phones. The communist leaders saying that mobile phones are going to be a plaything for the idle rich, and that India doesn't want them, they should be banned, etc. And now, communist mobile phones are chirping away in the phone of every communist leader, in the pocket of every communist leader, and so they should, because nothing has empowered the common man of India, including the unlettered working class individual, as much as the mobile phone has. So the communists have been consistently wrong on most of the things that have mattered in the last 20, 25 years of India's economic progress, and they've always learned their mistakes about 15 years too late. So, it takes 15 years of wrong decisions for a Buddhadev Bhattacharya to come along and actually have a progressive economic policy. But then, of course, he's resisted within his own party and eventually loses the election and he's out. Now, what are they doing right? It seems that what they're doing right, frankly, is spending taxpayers' money in buying voters' loyalties. And I'm afraid everyone can do that. They happen to be in power and they use that power well to distribute free kits to food kits, grain and rice and oil and spices and other essentials to people throughout the state. People in Kerala in particular, but everywhere in the world, I'm sure, are happy to get things free. And if that's all it takes, they'll do it. Similarly, payment of pensions. The government was right to ensure that payments of pensions would be made on time and in full. Whereas previous governments, including previous communist governments, had been less than consistent about that, largely because Kerala has an extremely overfunded, overstretched budget and is unable to often meet its obligations and payments and even salaries. And therefore, when the communists did this for the first time, people said, we're getting our pension, let's vote for them. Yesterday, I was being told in Thiruvananthapuram about a BJP worker who was canvassing for the BJP and privately saying that he was going to vote for the communists because he's got his pension every month this year. So that sort of thing has nothing to do with ideology as much as sensible, efficient targeting of government subsidies. And that they do well. And I'm not saying that's bad. I think if the Congress came to power and ran those things efficiently, the Congress would also get re-elected.
All right, just a couple of quick questions on the political scene, and then we'll shift to literature and language.
Okay.
Arguably, UPA 1 worked the way it did precisely because of the moral pressure that the left provided. And UPA-2 derailed the way it did because that pressure was removed, because they fell out on the nuclear deal, as you know. And this is a fairly accepted, I think, perception, fairly accepted, this is what really happened. So obviously the left may not come to power on its own, but it had the kind of influence on the Manmohan Singh government, the first, UPA-1 phase, which you saw the results when it wasn't there in the UPA-2. So I don't know whether the problem with the Congress really is that it has become proto-BJP in some sense, although it says it is against saffranism. Who opened the locks in Ayodhya? Who started this whole cultivating the soft saffron Hindutva vote? Who unleashed a Ramayana on media, which I know on television, and desecularized the media, which was until then strongly secular? It was a progressive, young, modern Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, not even one of the old Congress, leaders. So Congress, I think, has a kind of, it's a Janus-faced organization. It says something, it does something else. It has these regional satraps. It has a high command culture which is why you have this G23 and so on happening. It has feudalism of the worst order operating in its fold, which you're unable to, to get away with or to get out of. And the left, by comparison, is a progressive, is a modern, is a secular, some of the things you yourself enumerated, party. And the Congress, perhaps now, I'm putting it to you that now, when Rahul and Priyanka are doing what they are doing, and there is talk in some circles in the media that they are being more left, is that probably what is upsetting the diehard congressmen, those who have vested interests, and you're probably an exception in the G23, because I think 90% of them couldn't win an election if they stood for one. So what is this all about? It is an external pressure by Congress preventing the Congress. There's no fighting chance that Rahul Gandhi can bring about a change there, or Sonia or Priyanka. Unfortunately, it's a dynastic party. It is a high command-driven party. Everyone says without them you can't run the party, and everyone says without the Congress you can't have an opposition. It's a kind of vicious circle.
All of that is true. I'm not sure where to begin to comment, and I think we should move on to literature.
All right.
but let me say in all fairness that as far as the some of the things you said, I mean, yes, the communists were a very constructive force in UPA-1. They supported the Right to Information Act. They supported the Right to Education Act. They supported the efforts made to introduce NREGA. And all of these things, even if there's any quarrel about the origins or who takes the intellectual ownership of it, certainly it could not have been done without the support of the left. And I grant you that these were all very, very good and useful innovations. Some would say that they came from the National Advisory Council Sonia Gandhi had created of independent-minded experts, some of whom may have been left-inclined, but others would say it came because the CPM was in the de facto in the ruling coalition, was pushing for them. Be that as it may, all those were good things. And as you said, they very foolishly and unwisely broke with the UPA on the nuclear deal, having completely failed. Again, this is the kind of ideological blinkers these people wear. Having completely failed to understand how important that was to us, we had to break out of the isolation that we had been condemned to because of Pokhran, where our scientists couldn't get visas for scientific conferences in the Western world. That's how bad things were. And we were in a situation where the Chinese and the Russians and so on are merrily doing what they want as communist countries in cooperation with the West as it suited them and taking advantage of all that, whereas we were ostracized. And I think the left should really have had the brains to realize that this was a policy in the national interest about breaking out of India's isolation and did not sell any of India's interests to the Americans. In fact, to this day, there has been really nothing after the nuclear deal that the communists can point to saying this is why we oppose the deal. It was simply ideology, and that's one of the things that I find totally worth jettisoning about the left in India. Now, on the question of continuing deficiencies in the Congress party, as a Congress MP, I will simply say that these are perceptions that we know you hold, that many others have widely shared. We've had debates about this back and forth over the years, and I would rather put that subject aside for later simply because we're here to talk about a book. But that nonetheless, I do believe that what matters in politics are the ideas and values that a party stands for. And if you have to choose between the ideas and values that the Congress embodies and what the BJP is trying to do to this country as a votary of a particularly pernicious dogma, called not just Hindutva, I would argue it is more than Hindutva, it is Moditva. It is Hindutva plus an alarming personality cult, far worse than anything any high command in the Congress could ever have constituted. So I would say that for all of these reasons, we are facing a significant challenge, which I think obliges us to find the best vehicle, the best, shall we say, instruments to take on this challenge of the BJP.
Finally, on the political front, and this comes from the book, vis-a-vis fascism, the F word, as you call it, one of your chapters is called the F word. It's about fascism. And you're very wary there. You play a neat trick there, I think, where you cite Ashish Nandi, you cite Umberto Eco's 14 principles of what qualifies as fascism or what characterizes fascism, O'Toole on how a minority government can become fascist. And then, but you're not saying whether it's fascist or fascistic. You refuse to be characterizing it. You're just citing all of it, and the QED should say it's fascism, but you don't say that.
I want the readership to draw its own conclusions. But I will say, Shashi, in all fairness, that the word fascist has become just a routine term of abuse for so many in our political space.
True.
That it's become what the West calls a weasel word. There is a word from which all the meaning has been sucked out. So I thought, let me focus on the meaning rather than the word, because then the word becomes a red rag and people no longer think about the meaning. So what concerns me is that as far as we in India are concerned, these individual elements that constitute the problem with this kind of government, these need to be confronted, addressed, and overcome, whether or not you apply the label that begins with the letter F. That's the thrust of what I'm saying. And, honestly, I think genuinely that it doesn't matter very much what adjective we use. What we should worry about is deinstitutionalization, about the personality cult, about the intimidation of the media. I mean, all the 14 points of Eco that find their counterpart in India. He talks about racism or anti-Semitism. We can talk about Islamophobia. But we have equivalents for all of these elements that the world has been warning about since the 1930s. And I think, therefore, for us not to be aware of the dangerous direction in which some of our government's policies are going to be foolish. Having said that, we are still a democracy, whereas all these institutions are beleaguered, we are still able to have free and fair and honest elections. Undoubtedly, with an election commission whose conduct has not been exemplary in the last couple of years, but nonetheless, with a system where I don't think most of us actually believe that our votes are not counted accurately. I mean, I certainly can tell you that I was given all sorts of warnings as late as 2 days before the voting in my constituency that the machines had been rigged against me. And I won by almost a lakh of votes. So I'm assuming that even though I am a rather prominent critic, that the government is prepared to beat me fair and square, but also to lose to me fair and square, which they did.
Right. Now to come to language, for some reason in the social media, there's this caricature about you, about the words that you use, the big words, and the phobia. It's an unpronounceable name. You probably you'll be better at. It's called hippopotomonstrosequinellophobia or some such thing.
Sesquipedellophobia.
Yeah. It's but to be. I mean, then when one reads you. I mean, I raced through these essays, these 500 odd pages, and I probably tripped a couple of times on defenestration, which keeps coming off and on. And I think you like that word. You mentioned.
I like that word. I would confess to that. Yeah, it is.
Incidentally, we are all relieved to see that you've not been defenestrated from the Parliamentary Committee on IT, in the new order. So
I was fearing or expecting that, but it didn't happen. So I'm delighted.
That's good. And maybe a couple of other words like enthusiast, for the I think the
50s
part and so on and so forth. But for some reason, you have this caricature of using very big words, difficult words. Does that irritate you? Does that it's okay because you find words attributed to you. You find there's a narrative out there where people are having a ball with Tharoorism or Tharoorosaurus, as you call it. I really want to know what you thought of that.
Well, I mean, I think, frankly, it did irritate me at the beginning because I actually expostulated to people that if I could not communicate clearly, my books would not be selling well and my speeches would not find an audience and my articles would not be commissioned by editors and so on and so forth. Therefore, I assumed I was a clear communicator and what is more, a comprehensible one.
In fact, you have an essay about writing with short words, easy communicative language and so on. In fact, there's in this collection, there's one as well. Yeah,
that's right. So, I mean, I really genuinely have prided myself on being somebody who wrote to be read. I was never one of those people who would write something for his private satisfaction, put it away in a drawer, and not care about communicating. I was very interested in communication, and communicating was part of what, as far as I was concerned, the whole purpose of writing was all about. And therefore, I was irritated when people assumed or implied that my English was incomprehensible. And it really all began with one particular tweet where I let fly at a particularly egregiously offensive television anchor, whom I also then sued for defamation, but our legal process works in stately ways, so the case hasn't moved anywhere. And I used a word which I honestly have been using since debates at St. Stephen's College in the early 90s, but which for some reason was unfamiliar in India, namely farrago. Farrago.
All right.
Well, cattle class is another example where these things can go wrong, I'm afraid. Yeah. But when I used farrago, the Oxford English Dictionary tweeted in puzzlement that they couldn't understand why suddenly there had been 1 million searches for the word farrago on their dictionary site within a few hours, whereas there hadn't been 1 million sort of in the history of their dictionary, and they didn't understand why. It would get at most 1 or 2 lookups every year. And the reason was because Indians discovered this word, and then thereafter, of course, the caricature began. Now, after getting irritated, I decided that didn't do me very much good. First, it didn't silence the people who caricatured me. And secondly, as a politician, you don't want to go around sort of looking or sounding pissed off all the time, because it doesn't do you any good. So I decided to do what in history people have often done, which is to take something negative and cheerfully accept it as a sort of positive. It is said that when the American Republican Party was caricatured as a slow and cumbersome elephant by cartoonists, rather than reacting in an irritated way, they decided to make the elephant their official symbol. Right. And to this day, the Republican Party is drawn or depicted as an elephant, but now the sting has gone because it's no longer something against them, it's something they do themselves. So I decided, why don't I take this criticism and turn it to my advantage? And I did 2 things that were purely tongue-in-cheek, but which reinforced the image. One was when a particular chief minister who had run for election as an ally of ours against the BJP abruptly switched horses and joined the BJP side. And I tweeted one word. I said, snollygoster, definition, a shrewd and unprincipled politician, first used United States, 1845, most recent use today. And I didn't have to name the politician or the state or the situation. That tweet was enough, and snollygoster suddenly got into the Indian political vocabulary. Similarly, when my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, came out in late 2018, before the elections of 2019, I was asked by the publishers to announce on social media this book was coming. And I was very happy to do so, because obviously one wants to publicize his book. But I knew that every other day, some author or the other is tweeting, what could make my announcement stand out? So I said, well, since in any case, this book is bound to be dismissed by everybody as yet another opposition rant, and I want to assure the readers there's more to it than that, I tweeted, my new book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, is more than just a 500-page exercise in floxinosi nihilipilification. Now, again, that's a joke that goes back to high school days, not even college, right. Because at some point, kids interested in English would learn the longest word in the language. Yes. So one of the words you learn, it was a word that meant the act of estimating something or someone as worthless. But the moment I used it, of course, that tweet got multiplied hundreds of thousands of times, and the people started looking up the word. I did provide the definition, I think. If not, anyway, the definition was soon out. And then, to my horror, parents started getting their little toddlers to mug up this word and record little videos and send them to me. And whenever I went to my constituency, some poor little Malayali high aspiring kid would be wheeled out to recite Floxy Nosy Nihilipilification to me.
So Sashi, unbeknownst to you, you're a problem out there.
I am a problem, especially to little kids with overambitious parents.
Yeah, right. So, but interesting, in this day and age when technology also determines, I think, language to an extent. For instance, I've read about Ernest Hemingway that he wrote the way he did with very short, crisp words because, when he was reporting, he had to send his reports on the telegraph in those days, right? And so you paid per word. And so he economized on words, and he writes somewhere, he admits somewhere that put a premium on choosing the words which were shorter, and therefore he became very parsed in the way he wrote. He owned his writing.
In the opposite of Earl Stanley Gardner,
yes.
It was famously said of Earl Stanley Gardner that when somebody was shot in his detective novels, yes, the Perry Mason novels, it would always be bang, 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 because he was paid 10 cents per word. It's never one bang. That's 20 cents less.
Yes, yes. And in Kerala, for instance, take Kamala Das, and Soraya, she knew little. I mean, she had a limited vocabulary of Malayalam.
Oh.
And yet she's seen as one of the very good writers in Malayalam. I've heard that, it's not as if she had knew all the Sanskritized words. She used very simple Malayalam, but she wrote beautifully because, and I think I remember her saying to some of us who visited us that the limitation of the vocabulary helped her, have clarity in terms of what she expressed. So do you think creating words, you are what you call a logophile, right? Your love for your words, it becomes a problem that, you unknown to yourself, not that you're doing that, but I'm saying, you become denser in terms of the communication. You spoke about penetrative quality in communication, being lean and, parse in terms of what you express. Is that a liability now, particularly? So how would you see language evolving with technology, especially now when the millennial generation, they're using emoticons, they're using casual words, they're neologisms, there's a newly minted language, if you like, which keeps pace with technology. Do you think we need to shed this whole literary, kind of celebration in terms of language and look at it being more lean and functional and attractive and newly minted, to repeat what I said?
I actually agree with you, and except that in my case, my vocabulary doesn't come from straining for effect or trying to acquire words to show off. I happen to have read. No, I know
you're not doing
it. I just have read very widely, and so words pop up as the most appropriate ones to use in a particular sentence to convey a particular idea, and they turn out to be words that are actually quite unfamiliar to many people. And so then that reinforces the image that I'm being difficult. But as you said earlier, for the most part, my writing is not particularly, shall we say, incomprehensible. It is complex and dense. I write a traditional conventional sentence, which has complexity built into it. I actually find that ideas that flow in the English language when you are writing often require both length and multiple subordinate clauses if you want to convey a complex idea that contains within it a certain level of ambiguity or even a willingness to acknowledge a contradiction inherent in the idea you're expressing. All of that requires some complexity. And I tweeted the other day a quote by John Banville saying that, complex ideas require complex language and that he's tired of being attacked for being too dense because simple ideas can be expressed simply. Complex ideas require complex language. Now, this is a debate one can have, but in my own case, I have this sort of, I didn't realize that Kamala Das or Soraya, whom I always spoke to in English, had a limited Malayalam vocabulary, but I can assure you I have a limited Malayalam vocabulary. And my political speeches are essentially operating within a rather narrow template, but no one has ever accused them of being incomprehensible because I'm communicating very directly to my voters and my listeners, and for that matter, to television interviewers in Malayalam, without having to either use too much of English in the Manglish that we, you see this in Hindi a lot. There's a lot of English words being tossed into Hindi sentences by our politicians, even those for whom Hindi is very much their first language. Now, Malayalam is my mother tongue in the classic sense of the term. It is literally the language my mother grew up speaking, and arguably was for much of her life her first language and her principal language. It wasn't for me. I was brought up in a household where English was heard more often than Malayalam. I went to school in English, I communicated with my sisters, my friends in English, etc. So for me, the Malayalam that I picked up and articulated in my political life is really a Malayalam I picked up on the job, as it were, and therefore it's functional without being complex.
And you made the effort, unlike your predecessor in Trivandrum, Krishna Menon, who made
all his speeches in English.
English, absolutely. I think we've run out of time, so I can't resist this. You know, when I was thinking about these big words, you've become synonymous with big word for some, unjustly actually, but in the social media. So I was just thinking that if Shashi Tharoor were to be courting someone in a much younger age, shall we say, and he had to tell her, and one thing led to the other, and it came to asking whether you could kiss the lady, you'd say, may we,
osculate.
Say kiss?
Osculate.
Or would you say, shall we indulge in the anatomical juxtaposition of two orbicularis oris muscles in a state of contraction? Because that, I believe, is a scientifically accurate definition of a kiss. So
there you are.
That's where you are.
And if she says yes, then because she didn't understand the question, she gets what she wants. But in these days of Me Too, that isn't particularly wise.
It's not a good idea at all.
Not a good idea.
Not a good idea at all. Anyway,
better be clear and direct.
Thank you very much, Shashi. It's wonderful speaking to you. I mean, we could go on and on but the book, I think, says it all. And I'd once again remind those who are listening to this to get hold of a copy. And it's wonderful, easy reading, and there's a lot there. And as I said, Shashi Tharoor at his raconte best. All the best.
Thank you so much, Shashi. So it's Pride, Prejudice and Punditry, the essential Shashi Tharoor, the title of the book.
Yes.
Take good care, and lovely talking to you.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you.